Okay. Okay. So, so tonight we are all convening with also other communities in the world that are learning L'Zecher Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And I'm assuming that everyone here has also been in some way touched by his words, his Torah. The way I was speaking today, I was talking about him with the Yavna girls, and I was saying to them, have you ever seen, like, listened to a song or read a poem or read a story that just like verbalized something in a way that like you've never verbalized before, but it's exactly how you feel? Like, and like that's what Rabbi Sacks is for me. Like just reading his words, it's like just like verbalize something that I completely feel like in my whole being, but I've never verbalized it in that way. And once it's verbalized, you're just like, how did I never say it that way before? Like, how has it never been spoken before in that way? So what I wanted to speak about today, and they had a few different topics with materials that they brought in that people are using tonight to learn together. And I brought in also other materials from Rabbi Sack. So this shiur is based on a shiur that he wrote up on Parshat Masai. So just credit is to Rabbi Sacks. Okay, so we're going to begin, we have that question about Eretz Yisrael, right? That we have this chosen land, and our question is it warm? Did you record it? I'm gonna say it. No, I've just I gave like a longer introduction so you wouldn't miss it, but it's okay. We can have this too. Well, we can have it after for the break. We'll do it after for the break so that you don't have to. Okay. Either way. Okay, so the way that we're gonna start off with, talking about this question about is God in our hearts or bound by a land, we're gonna start off with the source of the mitzvah, right? So there's a whole array of different sources on whether or not it's a mitzvah, whether or not it needs to be written as a mitzvah, or it's just something that's like kamuvan me'elav, like it's completely understood. So therefore Rambam didn't write it as one of the mitzvot. It's a whole other shiur into it of itself. But I'm going to bring in the Ramban that speaks about where the mitzvah appears, and it appears in different, also expressed in different ways in different places. But on this pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, Perek Lamed Gimel, Sukim Nun through Nun Gimel, the first source that we have on your page, it says, "Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe ba'arvot Moav al Yodei Yericho lemor." So Hashem is speaking to Moshe, and he says to them, "Atem ovrim et haYarden el Eretz Canaan." You're going into the land of Canaan. You need to dispossess the land of all of the inhabitants that are there. And you have to take away all of the parts of them that have to do with avodah zarah. They needed to really rid the land of idolatry. And the last pasuk that's underlined, you shall take possession of the land and settle in it. Because for you, I have given this land, it's destined for you, in order that you will possess this land. So on this very pasuk, as you see in the second source on your sheet, that the Ramban says, "V'horashtem et haaretz v'yashavtem ba." On this pasuk, al dati zo mitzvah taseh. In my opinion, this is a mitzvah taseh. This is a positive commandment. Yitzaveltam sheyeshvu ba'aretz. He commanded us that we should settle the land and possess it. Ki nitna lehem v'lo yimasu b'nachalat Hashem. And they should not reject this inheritance. And if they think they have this opinion, maybe we should go and we should conquer a different land called Shinar, or the land of Ashur. We shouldn't do that. We have this positive commandment that we shouldn't reject the land that God has offered us. Rather, we must settle Eretz Yisrael. So if there were the Uganda plan, right, to maybe possibly settle a different land so that we can take care of the Jewish problem of security, no, the answer is here is that you must not go to Uganda. You need to settle Eretz Yisrael. And according to the Ramban, here we see that positive commandment. And it seems pretty clear from the psukim as well. So then we go on and we have a question. Rabbi Sacks asked the question. He says, if God, right, Judaism comes with this whole revolutionary idea that we are a monotheistic religion. We believe in one God and that God is not confined to any object, to any place, to anybody. God is everywhere and you can find him anywhere. So how is it possible that we're in a way confining God to a land, right? Why do we need God to be specifically bound by a land? And so if we look in, there's two different sources that the sages bring in that seem to be paradoxical. Okay, these two different sources. We have the Mechilta and Parshapo that says, wherever the Israelites went into exile, the divine presence was exiled with them. Okay, so we have this beautiful idea that God follows us. We were sent out of the land, the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, we had to leave, we went to Bavel, God went with us. Okay, but then we have another source that goes completely against this. Okay, and you see in Ketuvot, and they're speaking about the idea of living in Eretz Yisrael, living outside of Eretz Yisrael. If in a marriage one person wants to move, the other person doesn't want to move, and there's a whole discussion in the Gemara, and I'm just bringing a glimpse of this discussion. And they're talking about Tanu Rabbanan, that Liolam Yador Adam be'Eretz Yisrael. Okay, a person should always live in Eretz Yisrael. He should always reside there, even if the city is the majority of the city is Sheruba Goyim, the majority are Gentiles. And you should not live outside the land of Israel. Even in a place that's the majority, the majority is Jewish people. So if you have that choice, either you move to Eretz Yisrael in a place that it's not such a thriving Jewish community, right, versus a thriving Jewish community in Chutz La'aretz. In the Gemara, according to Rabbanan, the sages are saying here, you choose to live in Eretz Yisrael. And then they go even further than that. And this is an extreme statement, and I'm not saying it as a Mizrachi UK Slicha. This is here in the Gemara itself. Shekol hadar be'Eretz Yisrael domek mi sheyesh lo Eloka. Because anyone who resides in Eretz Yisrael, it's as if he has a God. V'chol hadar b'chutz la'aretz domesh k'mi she'en lo Eloka. And anyone who lives in Chutz La'aretz, it's as if he doesn't have a God. Okay, that's a very extreme statement here, right? So Rabbi Sacks asked that question. It seems to be a paradox. On one hand, you're the Mechilta, which is also the Chachamim. There's that opinion that Hashem follows us wherever we go, right? We have that idea that like the Mikdash Ma'at, the shul that we built, right? That's what we've always grown up on. Mikdash Ma'at, it's like a small Beit HaMikdash. God is with us wherever we go. And then you see here that in the Gemara, they're saying, whoever lives outside of Eretz Yisrael, it's as if he doesn't have a God. So how do we resolve that question? So if we look at the next source on page number 2 in Covenant and Conversation, he states the problem beautifully. The paradox of Jewish history is that although a specific territory, the Holy Land, is at its heart, Jews have spent more time in exile than in Israel, more time longing for it than dwelling in it, more time traveling than arriving. Much of the Jewish story could be written in the language of Parshat, I forgot to go down, of Parshat Maseh. They journeyed from X and camped at Y. Hence the tension. On the one hand, monotheism must understand God as non-territorial. The God of everywhere can be found anywhere. He is not confined to this people or that place, as pagans believed. He exercises his power even in Egypt. He sends a prophet, Yonah, to Nineveh in Assyria. He is with another prophet, Yechezkel, in Babel. There is no place in the universe where he is not. On the other hand, it must be impossible to live fully as a Jew outside Israel. For if not, Jews would not have been commanded to go there initially or to return subsequently. Why is the God beyond place to be found specifically in this place? Okay, so that's beautifully verbalized here. And so before we even elaborate upon that question, that we see that the centrality of Eretz Yisrael throughout the Tanakh, we have the beginning, the first journey to Eretz Yisrael is with what we read last week with Abraham, with his Lech Lecha. And then the next journey to Eretz Yisrael is when we leave Mitzrayim with Moshe, and our whole journey is through the Midbar to get to Eretz Yisrael. And then the Tanakh ends with our journey back to Eretz Yisrael with the declaration of King Cyrus, when after the first Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, 70 years later, the prophecy of Yirmiyahu is fulfilled, and we're called back to rebuild the second Beit HaMikdash. The Tanakh is really, the bookends are about Eretz Yisrael. Okay, so again, that even emphasizes that paradox, that what he's speaking about it. On one hand, there's such a huge emphasis on Eretz Yisrael, On the other hand, most of our Jewish history has been spent outside of Eretz Israel. We've been longing for it, as he says so beautifully, more time longing for it than dwelling in it, more time traveling than arriving. We're always say, I'm the wandering Jew, right? We're always wandering. So again, that question is, if God is so beyond place, why specifically is he found in Eretz Israel? What is so special about Eretz Israel? So Rabbi Sacks brings in two different sources that have more of a mystical tone to it. And we see it in the Kuzari, and then we see it also in Ramban, and how they describe what is special about Eretz Israel. So in the book of the Kuzari, which is Rabbi Yehuda Halevi's work, and he writes this incredible sefer. It's a Jewish philosophical book. Definitely recommend learning it with a teacher. It's a very, very special book. So you have the king of the Khuzars that wants to understand Judaism, and he wants to understand what is the true religion. So he goes to a Muslim, he goes to a philosopher, he goes to a Christian, and he goes to a Jew. And he speaks to them and asks all of his philosophical questions. Why is it that your religion is the true religion? Why is it, and he goes through all of these different questions. And here in this little tidbit that I brought here, he's having the conversation with the Chaver, which is the Jewish person, and he's asking him, what does it mean be'artso, that God has his own land? Like what is that referring to, right? He says here, I understand that we have his people. We already discussed that there's a chosen nation. Okay, that's a whole other conversation, how there's a chosen nation. But less intelligible is what thou sayest about his country, artso. How does God have his own land? And so the chaver, what they call here, the rabbi, what he goes on to explain is that the same way that there are certain lands that have specific climates in order to grow certain things, right? So let's say here he says, the rabbi, number 12, on the left side, how about the hill on which you say that the vines thrive so well? If it had not been properly planted and cultivated, it would never produce grapes. Priority belongs in the first instance to the people which, as stated before, is the essence and kernel of the nations. In the second instance, it would belong to the country on account of the religious acts connected with it, which I would compare to the cultivation of the vineyard. No other place would share the distinction of the divine influence, just as no other mountain might be able to produce good wine. So he's making this parallel to the way that there's a way to cultivate a vine that would produce a specific wine, so to the relationship between the Jewish nation and the land of Israel, which we also know historically is what happened, that the land lay desolate for thousands of years, as the famous Mark Twain speaks about. And then when the Jewish people came back, we had that relationship that we were able to bring the land back to be able to bloom. So there's that ecological connection that the Kuzari is speaking about, that this land cultivates prophets and a divinely inspired people. Okay, the Ramban gives a different answer, and he explains that Hashem created all. Okay, he created the tachtonim, the elyonim, the lower worlds and the higher worlds, and he gave each person, each nation, he gave them their own kochav umazal yadua. Right, so each nation is known for its own star or constellation that Hashem gave to them. He gives each person, he allotted to all the nations constellations in the heavens, and higher above them are the angels of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, who places lords over them. And he explained that there's these intermediaries that God, and we don't really understand, it's quite mystical, and Ramban is as a mystical views, and so he allots the signs and the stars and constellations and this indirect sort of rulership over the other nations. But for us, Aval Eretz Yisrael, towards the middle, towards the bottom, אמצעות היישוב היא נחלת השם מיוחדת לשמו, לא נתן עליה מן המלאכים קצין, שוטר ומושל והנחילו אותה. Hashem didn't place any sort of intermediary between him and his nation. It's only God. You guys are my special nation. You're my nation. Right? And I'm going to be your God. El Elohim acharim klal, right? You will not be subject to any other powers. So what Rabbi Sack is explaining, that the Kuzari, he's looking to the earth, right? He looks to the earth to explain what's special about Eretz Israel, that the soil, the landscape, the climate, there's some sort of mystical geography going on, that connection, that relationship between us and the land. Whereas Ramban is looking towards the heavens, right? That there's this direct relationship with God. There's this accessibility that are like our fortunes and our misfortunes are directly attributable to our relationship with God. Okay, so when we look at those two, we see sort of a mystical geography. But then he asks that question, how do we understand this in our own terms, more in our contemporary sort of terms, this sort of special relationship that we have in a non-mystical way of saying what's special about our relationship with Eretz Israel. And so if we go on and we look inside in covenant and conversation in the middle, forgetting to scroll down. Okay, so shout out to Manchester. It is possible to live a Jewish life in Manchester or Muncie. Muncie is where my father grew up, so it's all connected. Madrid or Minsk, but it is always a truncated experience. Only in Israel do Jews conduct their lives in the language of the Bible, within time defined by the Jewish calendar and space saturated in Jewish history. It's like every word, every sentence he said is like so much loaded, like you have to read it over and over again to really chap. Only there do they form a majority. Only there are they able to construct a political system, an economy, and an environment on the template of Jewish values. There alone can Judaism be what it is meant to be, not just a code of conduct for individuals, but also and essentially the architectonics of a society. Okay, so basically what he's saying is that there is that tension, right? It's not that it's a paradox, but it's a tension that it is possible to have our Jewish life, and no one would ever say like the Jewish people in Chutz La'aretz shouldn't keep the mitzvot, and of course the opposite, right? We should keep the mitzvot and we should always be investing in our Judaism, but it's not complete. And that's what he's saying here. It's a truncated experience, right? Because only in Israel we have that language of the Bible that we can speak in. And the Jewish calendar is what dictates our everyday life there. And only there can we make this a political system, an economy, an environment where it's based on our values, right? We have a whole system there. There's a medical system, there's a law system, there's just all systems that are based or with the potential to be based on not always, but the potential to be based on Jewish values, right? For only in Israel is God so close that you can feel him in the sun and wind, sense him just beyond the hills, hear him in the inflections of everyday speech, breathe his presence in the early morning air, and live dangerously but confidently under the shadow of his wings. It's like, whenever I read that sentence, you get the chills. It's like there's just this sense that you feel God's presence in a much more intense, authentic way when you're in that land. And also what he writes, dangerously but confidently, which is something that also on a personal level really resonates with us, that we do live in quite a hostile area surrounded by hostile villages. But like that idea of dangerously but confidently, that we're under the shadow of his wings, that we feel that presence, that God is all around us, that we're in this land that there's just that direct line of communication. And he goes on further in his book Future Tense. Judaism is the constitution of a self-governing nation, the architectonics of a society dedicated to the service of God in freedom and dignity. Without a land and state, Judaism is a shadow of itself. In exile, God might still live in the hearts of Jews, but not in the public square, in the justice of the courts, the morality of the economy, and the humanitarianism of everyday life. So that was also just, I thought, a very powerful thought, that he still lives in the hearts of people, but it's very individualized, or it's communal, right? But there's a very big difference between the individual, the community, and then the nation. And that's what he's speaking about here, that outside of Israel, we have God and we have that relationship, but we don't have that ability to build those structures, a moral economy, right? We're called upon to, as a Jewish nation, to build a moral society that's built in the image of a Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? And so here in Israel, it's the only place that we have that potential to build such a society. That's why everything is also so much more at stake when we're not fulfilling our destiny there. Jews have lived in almost every country under the sun. In 4,000 years, only in Israel have they been a free, self-governing people. Only in Israel are they able, if they so choose, to construct an agriculture, a medical system, an economic infrastructure in the spirit of the Torah and its concern for freedom, justice, and the sanctity of life. Only in Israel can Jews today speak the Hebrew of the Bible as the language of everyday speech. Only there can they live Jewish time within a calendar structured according to the rhythms of the Jewish year. Only in Israel can Jews live Judaism in anything other than an edited edition. In Israel and only there, Jews can walk where the prophets walked, climb the mountains Avram climbed, lift their eyes to the hills that David saw, and continue the story their ancestors began. That's also just a very powerful way that it's not an edited edition, but it's the full story, and it's that continuation of the story that our fathers have began. It is impossible to overestimate the impact of Israel on the formation of Jewish identity. Jewish existence, which in today's diaspora may appear random, arbitrary, and disconnected, in Israel takes on coherence. There the Bible comes alive against the backdrop of its own landscape and its own language, once again a living tongue. There too the concept of the Jewish people becomes vivid in the visible drama of a society gathered together as Moses said it would be from the ends of the heavens. Above all, it is in Jerusalem that the mystery of Israel becomes tangible. Here is the old new heart of the old new people, the place from which, said Rambam, the divine presence never moved. So that concept of old new, I think that he touches upon that quite often, that idea of that Judaism has that way of synthesizing between the ancient and the new, right? That we're still mourning for a Beit HaMikdash. Like what other nation do we see that still mourns for a temple that they had thousands of years ago, right? That it's something that's still very much alive for us. So it's that ancient and that new fused together. But then he asked this question, and I think it's also a very important question to ask. Why specifically this plot? Like why this land? And we often speak about how this land was chosen, but we don't ask that question, why specifically here? Why not England, right? Like why was that place chosen? And he said that we don't, he goes on to explain that we don't know for sure. It doesn't say in the Torah why God specifically chose this spot. We just know that he did choose that from the beginning of time, but he explains that the area, that the actual location can give us some sort of hint towards understanding why specifically this place was chosen, that our geographic location demands specific things from us as a nation. And he says it here beautifully in the last source. The cradle of civilization was not there. Okay, the way where we are placed is in between the three big continents. We have Europe, Asia, and Africa. We're like in the middle of those three big continents, but it's not a place that would be able to become a huge empire. Okay, just also by the way that the landscape is. It was in the alluvial plains of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the rich, well-watered lands of the Lower Nile. It was in Mesopotamia that the first city-states were built, and in Egypt that the greatest and longest-lived of ancient empires had its base. So Israel would almost invariably be a small country at the juncture of powerful empires in a simultaneously strategic and vulnerable location on major trade routes. Israel is not the Nile Delta or the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. It is a land dependent on rain, and rain in that part of the world is not predictable. But the passage intimates a correlation between geography and spirituality. Israel is a place where people look up to heaven in search of rain, not down to earth and its natural water supply. It is a place where you have to pray, not one in which nature and its seasons are predictable. As with its agriculture, so with its battles, Israel is a people that must lift its eyes to heaven. So I think that that's also a really powerful idea as well, that just by looking at our location, that we're surrounded. And nowadays we're not surrounded like the the Egyptians and all of those great empires. Now we're surrounded by hostile countries that call for the destruction of Israel. We're constantly under threat, and we're also constantly in need of rain. And so that causes us to always lift our eyes up to Shamayim, to ask for that rain, to not take it for granted, the way that in Egypt the Nile was just always flowing. That was the reason why Lot wanted to live in stone, because it was something that it was always aggregated, it always had water, and you didn't need to put in that effort into that relationship because it just existed. You just took it for granted, but you never had to do anything for it. You never had to work for it. And here in Israel, we always have to work for it. And we also, what he's explaining as well, that we're surrounded by other like empires, and we can never be that most powerful big empire, because it means that we need to look into ourselves to build a moral society that we would want to fight for, that we would want to have that courage to fight for, to feel that sense of belonging, that we want to fight for this land. And it's something that we saw then, and it's something that we see today, those two aspects of that constant living, the small Israel living under threat and needing to have one of the most moral armies in the world, one of the most caring, compassionate, moral armies in the world. That I know that the news might, portray it differently, but as having a husband in the Israeli army still to this day, and many friends that served in the army, and just knowing from the inside, living in the hostile areas that we live in, what those chayalim are told to do and the different missions that they go on at night, I can attest to that, right? Just from the inside of an army that has so much compassion and such a care for life, right? And so I think that just to sum up all of these different ideas that Rabbi Sack is speaking about, that he answers that question that we started off from: is God in our hearts or bound by a land? God is in our hearts, and he's also, his Shekhinah is just felt more in the land of Israel. That it's the land of Israel that's where we have that sense where the Tanakh comes alive. As I was speaking about today as well with my Yavna students, about the concept of a Tanakh Tiyul, that you can go on a Tiyul and bring your Tanakh and read about the battle of Shaul HaMelech in Har Gilboa, or the battle of David and Goliath, and be standing literally in the place where it happened, and read it from the psukim themselves, and that the story comes alive, and it doesn't feel like just this sideline story that we're learning about in school, the way that we're reading Shakespeare and Romeo and Juliet. It's something that's my story, that's my life, and I'm part of it, and I'm continuing this story by being here. And so that tension that we do live with, right? And we live with that now, that we have the diaspora Jewry and we have the Jewry in Eretz Yisrael. Bezrat Hashem, in the future, we can and be able to reconcile that tension, that we should all, Bezrat Hashem, return to be in Eretz Yisrael, that all of the nations of the world, we should have that vision that Yeshayahu speaks about, that peace, that vision, that all of us come to the Beit HaMikdash and serve God in a moral society. So, Amen. Stop.